So now we're into week 2 of this course, and in the first week, we looked at a couple of things. We had the designing your interior. We had, um, running the electric and designing the interior, if I recall correctly. Let me get back out to the main course here. There we go. All right. We went over some of the getting started area, setting that foundation, so how we get in there with some of those initial activities and things that are in there, and framing the walls. Steve, do you have any questions or comments on any of the content that we covered last week?
No, I was just at framing the walls, or I'm sorry, building the foundation and framing the walls is where I was at. Is that
Yep,
accurate?
that's
Okay.
correct. Yep,
All right.
I was
Good.
wrong. I'm all off. And so this week we're going to get into running the electric and designing your interior. And so running the electric is really, we have the walls of this course up, we have the base, we've started planning for it. And what do we do next? Assessment comes in here. I do have to add the terms to the assessment glossary. I always forget that when importing a new course, it brings the glossary over, but it doesn't actually populate it, and I have to upload those. So I'll take care of that today. But there are a couple of different ways to present some content to people, but also to evaluate and assess them. Even though, Steve, you're on the corporate side of things, we still have to assess learners. It looks a little bit different than higher ed. Higher ed has a lot of different things in there, papers and forums and things like that. But often on the corporate side, we give people the content, we have them take a post test, they get a certain score, and they move on. That tends to be fairly common, or they're working in a SCORM package or through an H5P, and at the end, we want them to have achieved a certain score. We're still assessing them, trying to make sure that they've picked up what they needed to move on. So we'll talk about a couple of assessment terms in there. And then we get into the lesson module. Um, in a little bit, we'll talk some about H5P, but the lesson module allows us to create either a linear and or branching or clustered pathway for people to gather information. So things that used to be on a slide deck, I can very easily put them into a lesson. The lesson does support images, text, video, and audio, but not images as like a background. So you have that, you might have an image on the page, and then you have the plain white page with the text on it. It is accessible, and it does have a couple of other features that you don't necessarily see in some of the other content types. For example, one of the completion criteria that you could use in the lesson is time spent on task. And it's one of the only activities in a Moodle-based system where you have that option. Um, while a pretty cool option, one of the things to keep in mind is that I could click to open the lesson, walk away for 15 minutes, and come back, and my elapsed time would still be 15 minutes. So it's really just looking at time spent in the lesson as opposed to keystrokes and mouse clicks and things like that. So that is something to know about that. But in the lesson, I can bring people through where they're just moving in a linear path. I could add questions, and how someone answers the question determines where they go next in the scenario or in the lesson. And I can create clusters of pages. So maybe there's a topic, and I want people to just look at a bunch of slides and information related to that specific topic. And when they reach the very last slide, then they come back into the main branch, continue on, and maybe have clusters of content as we go through. One thing I like about the lesson module is the ability to have an essay style question in there. So learners can provide some feedback. And then as a facilitator, you can go in and see all of those responses. This is different than H5P because in H5P, there's a very similar question, but as a facilitator, you actually are never able to see the responses that people submitted. Instead, when you set up that question type, you create some keywords during the setup process. And when someone submits into that essay style question, their submission is matched up via AI to the keywords that you put in initially, but you never actually get to see that essay question. You can't download them, you can't look at them. So if I were to have someone give me some reflection on things or fill out an essay or a short text answer of some sort, I would definitely use a lesson module for that. You can create opportunities for more personalized learning in the sense that how someone answers a question within the lesson can determine where they go next, but you can also give them options to make selections in a scenario. And so we might present a scenario and they could choose from one of the options in the scenario, and that choice determines what happens next. Still very similar to like if I were doing a multiple choice question, but rather than something just being, black and white, right or wrong, they're actually looped through to continue to see how things unfold if they've made that selection. Another tool that is sometimes used is the wiki. And the wiki has application in both higher ed and in corporate. On the corporate side of things, I think that the wiki is a really effective way to allow people, particularly like in an onboarding or something that is a little more lengthy, a program that's more lengthy, to provide some self-assessment and almost like journaling. I think back to when I was hired at eThink and I was hired in a cohort with one other person. And I remember when we started, that whole first week, I felt totally unqualified for this job. I couldn't figure out how they had hired me. There was so much to learn. And I thought to myself, I should have journaled that at the time because now I can look back and remember where I was and how far I'd come. And it's also a place where people can leave some feedback about the actual process. So either the program they're training in, or if it's an onboarding program or something. Wikis can be a collaborative space too, which, Steve, it may or may not really apply to what you're doing. But if I had groups of people who were doing work together, they could work together in a group wiki. That's less common, I would say, on, when we talk about people who are not in higher ed or K-12. Outside of those two sectors, it's very rare that people are doing, collaborative group work. But it is a nice place where people can kind of journal things. They can see it. The facilitator of the course can see the responses, but definitely is a place where people can do some self-reflection and also some self-evaluation. So Wiki can be a nice tool as we talk about performance evaluation. If people are kind of in there journaling, we've talked to some clients recently who are using the system for a lot of performance management and evaluation. Using the Wiki is an effective way to let people do some self-reflection and self-assessment throughout the year about how they're doing on things, what their pain points were, where they'd like to grow, what their goals are going forward. So Wiki has some interesting applications when we think about it in terms of not being in the higher ed or education sector.
Amy.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, and I'm glad you went down this path. We run an apprenticeship where the students, not only do they attend classes over the course of 2 years, but they continue to progress their skill set over the course, obviously, of the duration of their apprenticeship.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a component to this, the wiki, that what I heard you talking about is personal reflection, but also kind of group? Are both able to exist where if I'm keeping notes for myself, it's not visible to the group, but I want to, journal those for myself versus, what maybe my manager could see or I could share with the group and that type of thing?
So if it's just for me and I don't want my manager, my person who, facilitating or whatever to see it, Wiki probably isn't going to work well for that. But if I want it to be where I'm journaling for myself and they can see it, an individual wiki works. And then if I want a group space, I would just add another wiki to the course and set it up for groups. And the groups would be something that we create in the participants list where then we're able to kind of share amongst each other and contribute together.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. I've also used feedback for something similar when I want to be able to submit something and the facilitator be able to see it. Feedback can also be done anonymously. So if I wanted to be able to share my thoughts and feelings, but in an anonymous way, feedback is another way that we can do that. But the difference is that with Wiki, I can continue to build in the same Wiki over time. And I think that's where that reflective piece comes in, where I can go back and see the progress I've made, or, was this thing that I'm saying is a pain point for me today, the same thing that was a pain point 6 months ago when I started my apprenticeship. So, yeah. And Sarah and I were talking about H5P, but this is definitely something we could talk about too in an upcoming meeting where we just talk about ways that we could use Wiki also.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yep. We also then this week have a discussion on assessing your learners. And your learners may be those people coming through in your apprenticeship program or whoever is actually coming in and using that system for the purpose that you've created the courses. And there are lots of different ways we assess people. And you'll see that there is a pretty diverse makeup of people taking the course. So in the discussion, you'll see a lot of different thoughts about assessment. But we ask here, would the lesson module be something you'd use? Have you ever considered using its question pages as an alternative to like a traditional assessment instead of like a post quiz? Would you ask the questions throughout a lesson instead? And do you have other suggestions for how you might use lesson to assess people and whether or not it even fits for your industry? And if it doesn't, you can tell us that too, because I think that is always important as well. Then we get your feedback, and this is using that feedback module so you can get a feel for what that looks like, and just asking some feedback about your thought on the use of wikis and what your ideas might be there. We then will start to explore H5P, which is available in your site. More than likely, if you open the navigation drawer on the left, you will be coming down and looking for something called Content Bank with a paintbrush. In there is where you'll build your H5P. But before you even get to there, you can actually take a look at what some of the common content types are here. These are all examples that are built out. So when you click on them, you'll get to see the example built out. Course presentation is really replicating those slide decks that we used to use. When we did face-to-face training, we still had like a PowerPoint that we went through. And now because things are more hybrid or online, with the course presentation, we can still use basically a slide deck, but we can intersperse this with questions or videos or different activities throughout that course presentation and make the slide deck more interactive. Interactive video is probably the content type that I think has grown the most use-wise in the last year and a half to 2 years, because we are putting a lot of video online now. But, you click start a video, you walk away, you forget about it, you get bored, whatever the case is. With interactive video, we can have interactions that happen throughout the video. The video stops playing until someone interacts, meaning they answer a question or, they read something that's popped up, maybe like a signpost or something like that. And now we can create some interaction. So things are less passive and more interactive. We then get into things like image hotspots, find the hotspots. For image hotspots, I might have an actual image of something. And as people scroll over it and they click on the hotspots, they find out information about things in the image. So let's say I was running a machine shop and I'm orienting people to using, something in the machine shop. I might actually have that piece of equipment there in a picture. And when people click on the different hotspots, a text box comes up and explains to them exactly what that is, why it's important, how to use it, what needs calibrating, things like that. For find multiple hotspots, I used to use this when I was still working. So I was an environmental scientist previously, and I had a hazardous waste operator certification. And so find multiple hotspots was something that many years down the road, when I was working with a team to create a HAZWOPER course online, we used. So we put up an image of a site, and people had to find the different things in there that would be important if you were out there doing a hazardous waste survey or doing any type of cleanup or anything like that. We also used to put like pictures of like equipment rooms, and people would have to find like all of the different things to do, well testing or whatever. So find multiple hotspots is a pretty cool activity type also. We then show a little bit about column, and I like to use column here and talk about it because column lets you kind of create basically what looks like a really nice looking web page. But there's also an activity that's not featured here called interactive book, and you can find it out there at h5p.org. So h5p.org. And interactive book is just a series of pages. So it's like each page is column, and you just build it out, and you can actually create a really nice book. We also have image slider. Image slider is actually like a presentation, like a slide deck of just images. And so the one in here will take you to one that's pre-built. We've done some in the past that were things like the before and after the Mount St. Helens eruption and things like that. So image slider lets you put together a sequence of images, and it's just images, no real text on the screen where people can just go through the images. We then round out this section with 2 lesson examples. Jack and the Beanstalk, which takes you through a story and you're answering questions as you go through. And Can You Make a Revolution, which reminds me a lot of those choose your own adventure books that I used to read as a kid, because I'm presented with this thing that's happening, that's unfolding in front of me, and I get to make decisions. And the decision I make determines what happens to me next in the story. And so as you go through those, you can start to think of how those might apply to some of the things that you're doing where you are. Our last bit of content for this week is called Designing the Interior. And so when we are building this learning environment, this house, we want to make sure that our learning environment is accessible for everyone and inclusive of everyone. So, whether someone needs to use assistive technology to help with the reading, um, the text things, or whether or not we need to make sure that um, there's other pieces in here that need to be accessible, such as color and things like that. Video needs to have transcript, all of these things. In this week's content, we will look at how to build accessible content. We have an H5P on universal design for learning, and this is a framework to help you as you're designing your courses so that you can actually stimulate the different parts of people's brains and their thinking, but also make sure that the environment is inclusive. And so, you'll hear people say from time to time, I'm not a good test taker, or I'm not good at writing a paper. And so UDL helps us to think about, how do we make sure that we are assessing and presenting content to people regardless of how they are best approach that type of content. Then we have the 4 C's of inclusive and accessible course design. And this module is created by our colleague, Michael Vaughn. And this is something that he has spent some time building up over the years. And he talks about how when we are creating courses and we try to make them accessible for people, our only frame of reference is really our own experience with accessibility or inaccessibility, and making sure that we are being compassionate and that we have context and that we are looking at things in a way that allows us to think about things that are completely have never touched our lives. And so Michael gets into how we can create accessible and inclusive design for people with both observable and hidden impairments and disabilities. And his video series covers 4 principles and how you might apply them to course design. And then what you'll find is he included a bonus video here about how we transcribed 6 videos in 1 hour. So, one of the things that often happens is people say that creating a video transcription takes too long. Michael pulls his transcripts in through YouTube Studio, and does auto sync to like bring together the transcript. I will often open up Microsoft Office and open up a Word document or Google Docs and turn on the speech to text feature. So when I'm creating my own video or I'm playing a video, that speech that's happening for that video actually automatically transcribes into one of the documents, and I can just fix it up, go through and make some changes to make sure that everything is clear and makes sense. And then I have a transcript. So in here, you'll find out some tips for making those transcripts happen much more quickly and easily. Any questions on anything that we have for this week? All right. Well, that's what we have for this week. I'm here. If you have any questions, you can post them in the raise your hand forum, or you can message us, or even, if it's something specific like, how do I create an H5P on the site, you can open up a support ticket for that, and we're happy to respond to you. But I'm around if you need anything. Otherwise, I won't keep you here any longer. I'll stop the recording now. But if you have any other questions, Steve, just